ask the first question. And like I said, our focus has been Chapter 5, but you do not have to stay with Chapter 5 because we want your entire repertoire of knowledge. But will you please share with us some of the more important terms, for example, imposter syndrome, that faculty and students alike should understand? And what others should we be aware of?
Well, the imposter syndrome is the sense that as a student, you feel you don't really cut it in terms of your academic ability, that you don't really deserve to be in an educational environment, that somehow admitting you to a program has been a bureaucratic error. And so you live with this sense as a student that you're an imposter, that you don't really belong in the academy. And you have the feeling that sooner or later you're going to say something in class or submit a written paper or assignment that is so off the mark that your impostership will be found out and you'll be asked to leave the institution under a cloud of humiliation and shame and embarrassment. And I first was interested in how prevalent this was amongst adult learners. Particularly, I used to work in a community education, community development context, and so worked with people who were illiterate or people who left school 14, 15 with no qualifications. And part of my work was running an educational advisory service and teaching basic study skills classes to these kind of adults. So I wasn't surprised that adults who the formal education system had defined already as mediocre would feel this sense of impostership. But what did surprise me was just how widespread this is amongst particularly adult students of all levels. So, I suppose the highest level I've taught at was when I was a visiting professor at Harvard University, and I taught there in 2002. And I would say that students, doctoral students in the Harvard Graduate School of Education felt just as much like imposters as adult students who had left school at 15 and were taking my introduction to study skills classes back in England. So, I've really been interested in how this sense of impostership can stop people moving forward with their studies, particularly if as a student you feel that you're the only one in this situation, that everybody else feels confident and comfortable and is moving ahead, but you're the one person who is there sort of under false pretenses. So something I always tell my own students who are going to work with adults is you have to find a way to name impostership early on in a course or a new program, to talk about it openly. Maybe as the instructor, you can talk about your own sense of impostership that you felt as a student or that you're feeling as an instructor, because it's interesting to me that so many teachers, professors, trainers, instructors have the same sense of impostership about their own role as teachers, as the students. So I'm very interested in making this public knowledge early on in the hope that once students understand, well, this is quite normal, it's predictable, it's natural, and a lot of other people are feeling this, then it loses some of its power to undermine your morale and undermine your momentum. So that's something that I think is really important, is to name that early on. The other, I think, factor that we need to talk about is also the factor of cultural suicide. Do you want me to talk about that now or in a subsequent question?
Please do, because we are a very diverse community and a very diverse school. And whether or not, I think that we have a lot of cultural suicide taking place on our campus.
Yeah, okay. Well, that term, which, using the term suicide is a pretty dramatic one, but I really wanted to get across the sense that cultural suicide is something that a lot of students have to negotiate. It's the sense that when you as a student, particularly if you're someone, let's say, who's first generation in your family to go into higher education, you arrive at college, you find out that new horizons are being opened up for you, you are developing new skills, you're becoming more confident about your abilities, and all these are great things to happen. And you go back to your family or your community or your friendship network or your neighborhood, your church, and you start talking about the changes that are happening to you in a college or a higher ed environment. And you start talking about new ideas, new skills, you're using different language, new terminology. And instead of people celebrating along with you regarding the changes that are happening to you, instead what happens is that people are threatened by the changes, and they may not say anything to you, but internally, privately, they'll be thinking, I don't know you anymore, you're getting too big for your boots, you're now using $20 academic terms, you're not the person that I thought I knew, and so, I don't really want to interact with you in the same way or to the same extent as previously. So I think that it's something that we need to make learners, particularly adult learners, aware of. That, I think sometimes the cultural suicide is felt in racial terms. If you're a racial minority and you come to a predominantly white institution and you're using white academic language and terminology, then, you can be perceived as somehow betraying your racial identity. If you're from a well-defined religious background and you go back to your peers and you start talking about the importance of thinking critically about faith and other things, you can be seen as very threatening. If you're from a working class, blue-collar background, you go back and you start using terminology and jargon that's unfamiliar. All those things, I think, are risky for students. So one of the things that I've been interested in over the years as an instructor is preparing students to re-enter their family, their friendship networks, their neighborhood, their church, their community groups, to re-enter all those settings after they've had a period in education. And actually, when I was working with adult illiterates, one of the things that we would do regularly was with different groups, I would role play what you as a student are going to do when you get home after class. And so we'd role play this in class, and typically in the role play, what would happen is that students would, perform as if they were just coming home. They would be talking about what went on in class. They'd be saying, oh, so-and-so made a joke tonight, or the teacher really praised something that I did, or I tried out this exercise, it went really well, or I heard this new idea that's really interesting. And the person who is the other person in role play, the person at home, would hardly be able to get a word in edgeways. So one of the things that the students came up with was a set of rules to frame cultural re-entry for how you interact when you get home after class. And the 4 or 5 rules they came up with were: number 1, when you get home, the first thing you do is ask the person at home what's happened to them while you were away. Secondly, if the person at home has made any effort or sacrifice to let you go to class, you find a way of thanking them. Thirdly, you don't talk about what happened in class until the person at home asks you, how did things go tonight? And fourth, when you start talking about what happened in class, you start with an experience involving some kind of uncertainty, so that you don't come across as, talking about a big triumph. Instead, you say, well, I had this exercise that I found really difficult, but I managed to get through it without really screwing it up badly or something like that. And I found that very insightful from the students. And actually, I've used all those rules, as a faculty member whenever I bring back to my department a technique that I've discovered at a professional conference or some kind of resource at a workshop that I've been to. When I come back to the institution, I follow those rules. I ask my colleagues what happened while I was away. If someone's covered for me, I find a way of acknowledging that and offering to cover for them. I don't talk about what I learned at the conference until someone asks me, or at least I try not to. Sometimes I can't follow that rule. And then when people do ask me, I'll say something like, well, while I was at this conference, I learned a great technique for getting quiet, introverted students to participate in class, or I learned this great technique for stopping domineering individuals from taking over the class. And I'll say, you probably worked out how to deal with this situation years ago, but, I've never really felt I was able to do that very well. So this thing that I learned at this conference or at this workshop really, really helped me. And then what happens often is I get an email the next day or a phone call from the person I was describing the technique to, and they'll say, well, this technique that you told me about yesterday, I have a friend at another college who has a problem with this. Can you just remind me what the technique was? And of course, they're really asking for help themselves. So I think, as I think about student retention and student attrition, most of the things that typically get talked about have to do with finance, and this is very important, obviously. It has to do with logistics, of transport, of working multiple jobs, of arranging daycare, and so on. And all that is incredibly important, but I think in some ways just as important, which doesn't get talked about, is the imposter syndrome and this risk of committing cultural suicide, because if a student goes back into their community and they find that they're being ostracized, who's going to want to carry on with education in a situation like that? If you're forced to choose between the community that's defined and sustained you up to that point in your life and college, I think a lot of people are going to say, goodbye to college. My community, my identity here is way too important. So preparing students to be aware of this risk, I think is an important element in retention initiatives.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your book. It's had a wonderful impact on me as a new faculty, and I'd like to give Patricia, Dr. Holt, a lot of praise because she brought us together and led us through this book, and it's been just a great experience. And Armstrong at Atlantic State for the vision that they had to allow us to work within this book and help students succeed. The second question I'd like to ask relates to supporting our students who are experiencing negative emotions and perhaps getting at that concept you talked about, the anxiety of personal change, which how we minimize personal failure.
Yeah, one of the things, and by the way, thank you for those nice comments about the book. I mean, it's just a massive ego trip for me to be able to speak to you and to know that the book is being used. I mean, I wrote it for that purpose, to be helpful and to be used. So that's really great that you're finding it useful. I think one of the things that I've always tried to do as an instructor, particularly since I came up through the sort of community development, community ed, adult literacy avenue, is to be aware that first class, it's crucial that students leave the first class feeling that they've completed something successfully. So I'm always interested in designing some kind of activity, the first class, which everybody can successfully complete, because I feel that if you leave the first class feeling that you've done something successfully, this is kind of addictive. It helps bolster your fragile confidence. So let's say you're like one of the class things I had to do in the study skills courses for adults who wanted to go to college was that I had to introduce some basic mathematics. And nothing terrifies adults more, in my experience, than being told they got to do maths or stats, at least for a lot of them. So, but the one thing that I knew that every student in my class could do would be to talk about an experience in which they had found trying to use maths or to use statistics to be confusing or difficult. So I would just that first night go around the group and ask, and I'd kick it off myself by talking about an experience where I had trouble using maths, and it was easy for me because I failed my math high school exam at 16 twice. I only got it the third time running, and I was actually kept out of the college track in high school because I was just a mediocre student. So I kind of start off talking about that. And the students go around and they talk about their difficulties, and all this time I'm sort of supporting them and trying to praise them. So they feel that they've done something that has caught my attention the first class and that's received some positive feedback for me. So for me, a failure-proof activity is like the sort of gold standard of first-class teaching that I'm always looking for. And when I come across those, I just hold on to them like gold dust. And then I think in terms of students feeling like, we're imposters, we're not going to make it here, they're feeling a fragile sense of confidence, they hear new terms, they're in a new environment. I think in a situation like that, from my point of view, using former students to come into the class and testify to their experiences of being new students at the institution is really helpful. So whenever possible, at the first class, I'll have maybe 10 minutes that evening or that day devoted to having maybe 2, 3 former students who were in the group last year just come to my class if I can persuade them to do this. And I turn that 10 minutes over to former students and I tell them, just talk to the new students about how you felt the first day of class and what it was that helped get you through this first class. And when the former students do that, they use examples and language that the new students are very familiar with. And I think that has a real advantage because, I've been teaching since 19... So I find that having taught, for 40-something years, it's very hard for me to recreate emotionally what it must feel like to show up in the first day of a program that I am teaching with. But students who were in the program last year do know what that feels like. So I'm always looking to bring them in to testify, really, to bear witness to the experience, because anything that they say is going to have far more weight and power than, the most brilliant argument that I could come up with about why this course is going to be useful. I think students will sort of screen out what I say, but a recent former student, they'll listen to that person and take them seriously. So, and the recent former students, when they come in, they talk about feeling like imposters. They talk about cultural suicide. They talk about how difficult sometimes it is to negotiate the changes that they're going through. They'll talk about the rhythms of lost innocence and road running that I describe in the book. They won't necessarily use those terms, but they'll talk about, getting halfway through the first semester, feeling like things are going okay, and then all of a sudden feeling like, you're just in limbo. You've reached this point where you don't really know what is happening, and you feel very unconfident and feel like, I should drop out. So having former students chart out the emotional territory and kind of draw a map of the emotional geography for the new students is something I use all the time.
The next question really had to do with cultural suicide, so I'm going to rephrase and ask you a little bit more about road running, because I have taught out of this book for about 5 years now. And I always get to the part about Wile E. Coyote and how he realizes all of a sudden that the ground beneath his feet is gone. And I have always students telling me, I feel like that, what can I do? Well, we know that their friends, as you say, pick them up, dust them off. But what are some things we as instructors can do to help our students through this?
Yeah, that kind of Wile E. Coyote moment is when, for those who haven't read the book or maybe looking at the video, Wile E. Coyote is chasing Roadrunner in the cartoons, and the same scene is repeated over and over again. Roadrunner gets to a canyon, goes straight across to the other side without stopping. Wile E. Coyote gets to the canyon, chasing Roadrunner, launches himself off into midair, but halfway across the canyon, loses momentum, looks down at the canyon floor, sees, nothing beneath him, and once he realizes he's in midair, gravity kicks in and he crashes to the floor of the canyon, and there's limbs all over the place, or his body image is imprinted on the canyon floor. And then in the next scene, he's been magically reassembled off camera and the chase is on again. And what I was arguing was that the moment that Coyote gets halfway across the canyon and realizes that there's nothing solid underneath him is a very predictable moment in a lot of study cycles and experiences that students have where they sort of got the basics of a subject, and now they're moving into understanding that in fact it's not quite as basic as it seems, and there's grayer territory and things are not always clearly right or wrong. And at those times that they often feel like they're in limbo and they lose momentum and crash emotionally to the floor of their canyon. And I had argued in the book that what gives students a parachute is having a small healing network where you can talk about your Roadrunner moment and others can talk you through it and empathize with you and give you strategies and so on. But, the question about what instructors can do, I think one thing that I do is after I've taught a class 3 or 4 times, I get a sense of when a majority of students are going to be in their Roadrunner moment. And I can anticipate this, hopefully. I can let students know that it's coming up. I can say that typically around this time in the semester, your level of frustration or uncertainty or anxiety is probably going to start peaking, because this is what has happened with different groups in the past. So if you're feeling like that, don't be alarmed. What you're feeling is completely predictable and normal. It doesn't mean that you're not going to make it. This is just part of the rhythm of learning. We need to sit with this uncertainty for a little bit. So I'll, try and signpost that this is coming as much as possible. Secondly, I'll try and use my own autobiography as a student and as a learner to talk about the ways that I've experienced this Roadrunner moment. And because, one of the classes I teach, for example, teaches a body of work called critical theory. Is extremely, jargon written. A lot of the ideas I find the readings difficult to understand. So I will often talk to my own students about how I struggle to understand this material and try and, draw on my autobiography in that way, so that they know that I'm familiar with this as well as them. And then the third thing I do is, I do a weekly anonymous evaluation of the class using the critical incident questionnaire. And if people are feeling this sense of being in limbo, that comes out, loud and clear on the responses for that week. So when I meet with the group the subsequent week, I can talk about how, well, at this point, it's clear that a lot of you are feeling like you're floundering, like the rug is being pulled out from under you, that you're starting to realize that some of this is a lot more complex than you thought. And hopefully I can address those fears in the moment. So having some kind of continuous formative evaluation. It doesn't have to be the critical incident questionnaire. It can be any one of a number of classroom assessment methods. But getting regular information from students about where they are means you can address this Roadrunner moment, very close to the time when it occurs. And I think that's, another important element in keeping student attrition to a minimum, is being able to deal with problems as they're arising in the moment and not waiting till the end of the semester, by which time it's often too late for a lot of the students.
What advice would you give to someone who is starting to teach about the emotional ups and downs that they can expect in their work?
Well, I think I do a lot of mentoring with new faculty here at my own institution, and it's interesting to me that first and second year instructors, most of the conversations we have are about either emotional survival, that you just mentioned, Megan, or negotiating the politics of the department and the politics of the institution. On the emotional thing, I think that someone like me, see as a senior member of the faculty, it's very important that we talk out loud our own emotional ups and downs. So I meet quite regularly with all first-year faculty. We have a first-year orientation program. They meet once a month. And when I'm called in to speak to them, I typically say, well, this thing happened in class this weekend, or this thing happened in class last night. And even though I've been teaching for 43 years, I felt like a complete rookie because it caught me off guard. found myself making a basic mistake. So even though I've been teaching for over 4 decades, I still make mistakes all the time. So I'm trying to disclose and model the fact that being taken by surprise is just an inherent part of teaching, in my experience. And because even though I've been doing it for 40 years, I feel my emotional lows and I agonize over my mistakes pretty much the same way now as I did 40 years ago. So I want them to know that agonizing over your mistakes is normal and natural. You don't want to take it to crippling proportions, otherwise you'll get so weighed down with your imagined incompetence that you won't be able to do anything. But I do want them to know that, messing up is not the end of the world and is natural and common. What I usually tell them is find a teaching partner or a buddy or someone else in the first year group that you can have coffee with or exchange emails with or tweet with on a kind of weekly basis, and just sort of touch base with each other, because I'm thinking that your partner is going to be having many of the same experiences as you are, and so knowing that somebody else has gone through something similar to what you're going through, your emotional balance about what's happening. I personally feel that if I was the provost or vice president of an institution, and one day, someone, Bill Gates said, you can have as much money as you like to rearrange the first year experience for students, the first thing I would do would be to say to all first year faculty, you're going to teach all your courses as teams. We're not going to have solo teaching anymore. We're going to teach as a 2 or 3 person team. And maybe there'll be 2 first year instructors, and then there'll be a 5 or 10 year instructor with you. Because I think when you have someone who is in the room with you, they can help keep you on an emotional even keel. They can help you keep things effective so you don't get carried away, unrealistically when things go well, but you're not sent to the depth of despair either when things go badly. So for me, you've got to set up some kind of peer contact, peer conversation. And it works best when it's actually in the room with you in a team teaching situation. But most people don't have the luxury of that. So in lieu of that, I think you have to have, 1 or 2 buddies that are always ready and waiting to give you some encouragement.